Horror story. It all began the night the old forester stumbled out of the woods, his eyes wild with terror, his face pale and drained of life. I had seen him around before. The man practically lived in those woods. Nothing ever seemed to scare him, until that night. He didn't say a word. He couldn't. His lips quivered, but nothing escaped. His frail body collapsed to the ground, and a nearby ranger rushed to his side. They carried him away, but the look on his face stayed with me. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something primal. I was 19 at the time, and people always said I was too brave for my own good. I couldn't let it go. Whatever had shaken him like that, I had to see it for myself. My curiosity gnawed at me, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized I wouldn't be able to sleep until I knew. So, the next night, I ventured into the forest. I told no one. It was foolish, I know. But I had something to prove, maybe to myself more than anyone else. The air was crisp, the woods darker than I remembered. The trees stood like towering shadows, their twisted limbs reaching out as if they were trying to warn me away. At first, it was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses down on you like a weight. The only sound was my own breath and the occasional crackle of dry leaves beneath my boots. I convinced myself that everything was normal, that the forester must have seen something, anything, unrelated to the eerie stories people told about the woods. But the further I went, the more I noticed things. It wasn't just the thickening canopy overhead that made it hard to see. The trees seemed to grow closer, the branches tangling together like gnarled hands grasping at one another. The undergrowth thickened, and the air took on a heavy, oppressive quality. It was as if the forest itself was changing, becoming something darker, more alive. I pressed on, determined not to turn back. But the deeper I went, the more I felt watched. It was subtle at first, just a prickle at the back of my neck, a whispering in the leaves. I paused, glancing around, trying to spot anything out of the ordinary. Nothing. The woods were still too still. Suddenly, I heard it, a faint rustling like something moving through the brush. My heart pounded in my chest, but I told myself it was just an animal. Maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. But the sound wasn't right. It was too deliberate, too slow. I swallowed hard and continued. The path became less familiar the further I ventured. Trees twisted at unnatural angles, their trunks bent and gnarled as if something had tried to pull them from the ground. My flashlight beam flickered against their bark, revealing deep gashes as though clawed hands had scraped across them. A cold sweat trickled down the back of my neck. I tried to calm myself, to focus, but there was something else now. A new sound. Breathing. Faint but unmistakable. It wasn't mine. I stopped dead in my tracks, holding my breath, listening. The breathing was steady, rhythmic, but it wasn't human. It was low and guttural, like the exhale of something enormous just out of sight. I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction. But there was nothing. Just trees. Just the thick, suffocating dark. Still I could hear it, closer now. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to keep going. That strange breathing, it felt too close, like it was just behind me, lurking in the shadows I couldn't see. But something compelled me forward, a mixture of stubbornness and the nagging need to know what had happened to the old forester. As I moved deeper into the woods, I began to notice something strange. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then I saw them clearly, footprints. Large, uneven prints, scattered across the damp earth. They weren't normal animal tracks, and they certainly weren't mine. They looked human but wrong. The spacing was erratic, as though whoever had made them had been running, desperately. I crouched down, my flashlight beam tracing their outline. The deep impressions in the soil suggested someone had been sprinting for their life. My mind flashed back to the forester, his face frozen in that terrible, wordless fear. Had these been his prints? I stood up and followed the trail. Every few feet, the prints would falter, drag as if the person had stumbled. As I pressed on, I began to notice marks on the trees too, deep scratches gouged into the bark. It was as if something had been pursuing him, something that could keep pace with his terrified sprint. The closer I got, the worse the trees looked. Some had huge chunks of bark stripped away, the wood beneath scarred with long, jagged marks. It didn't make sense. No animal in these woods could have done that, not with such violence. And yet, the scratches looked fresh. I told myself it was nothing, just a product of my growing paranoia. But deep down, I knew something was wrong here, something far beyond my understanding. The forest felt alive around me, oppressive, like it was watching me, waiting. Suddenly, through the thick underbrush, I saw a shape emerge in the distance. It was a small, dilapidated cabin, the forester's house. The sight of it sent a wave of both relief and unease through me. It sat hunched between the trees like it had been forgotten, half swallowed by the forest around it. I approached cautiously, keeping my flashlight low. The closer I got, the quieter the woods became. No rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, just silence. That thick, suffocating silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. The cabin's front door was slightly ajar, creaking on its hinges. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped onto the creaky wooden porch. Everything about this place felt wrong, like it had been abandoned for years, yet I knew the forester had been here just days before. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. The air was thick and musty, the smell of damp wood and dust filling my nostrils. The interior was as simple as you'd expect from a man who lived alone in the woods. A small table, a chair, and a bed tucked away in the corner, all covered in a fine layer of dust. There was no sign of a struggle, no signs of any disturbance at all. And yet, something about the place felt off, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I started looking around, shining my flashlight in every corner, searching for anything that could explain the forester's panic. Nothing stood out. Just old, worn furniture, and the creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. The unease was gnawing at me, but I told myself it was just the isolation of the place. But then I heard it again, soft, deliberate breathing. I spun around, pointing the flashlight toward the window. At first, I didn't see anything. But as my heart thudded in my chest, I caught sight of something. Something just outside the window, half hidden behind a tree. I froze, the beam of light trembling in my hand. It was a figure. Pale, unmoving, almost blending into the night. Its face was obscured by the shadows of the trees, but I could make out its silhouette. A person standing unnaturally still. I stared at it, my mind racing. Was it someone from the nearby town? Another forester? But it wasn't moving. It just stood there watching me. And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't standing behind the tree. It was halfway behind the tree, as if it was part of the trunk itself, almost melding with the bark. My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't a person. It was something else. My legs felt like lead, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure didn't move, didn't even flinch. It was like it had been there the entire time, just waiting for me to notice it. And then, slowly, it began to shift. Not walking, not stepping forward like a person would. It just glided smoothly toward the window, its form still half obscured by the tree. My flashlight flickered, and in the brief moment of darkness, the figure was suddenly closer, just a few feet from the window now. I tried to move, but my body refused to cooperate. I could only watch in horror as it slid closer, its features still hidden in the dark. But I could feel its gaze, cold and hollow, fixed on me. I wanted to scream, to run, but no sound escaped my lips. I was frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure was at the window now, its face finally coming into view, or what should have been a face. It had none. Just a smooth, featureless void where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. My flashlight flickered again, and in that split second the figure moved. It lunged at the window with an unnatural speed, its form blurring as it slammed against the glass with a deafening crack. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight as the window shattered. A cold, inhuman hand reached through the broken glass, and before I could even react, it was on me. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs. The coldness of it seeped into my skin, paralyzing me with a bone-deep chill. I tried to fight, to push it away, but my limbs were sluggish, heavy, like they were no longer my own. The last thing I saw was that featureless face hovering inches from mine, and then everything went black.